Welcome to World at Work TV. I'm Allison Avalos, and I'm joined today by Kent Plunkett of Salary.com, and we're here to talk about some of the trends with market pricing and some related topics. Hi, Kent.
Hi, Allison. Thanks for having us.
So I'd like to start off by talking a little bit about some of the trends we see in our space. World at Work has obviously published a salary budget survey for a long time, and we've seen that movement slow down in recent years. There was quite a rise coming out of the recession, but it's been very static since. I'm curious to know what it looks like on the market pricing side of things, and are organizations still approaching those processes on the same annual cycle that or maybe every other year that they did before, or has there been any shift there?
Salary increase budgets have stayed relatively static over really the last decade, since the crash of '08, and it's been a long, slow road to getting back to how things used to be. A lot of people are unsure that they ever will get back to how it used to be, and I think that's driven some really dramatic changes in how compensation professionals deal with the money that they have available to them. And we see that a lot of people are moving away from spreading out that salary increase budget like peanut butter, and they're moving much more to rewarding high potentials and high performers with larger increases. And trying to allocate the money more based on performance, and trying to use that budget also sometimes to drive a more frequent performance management discussion than once a year. And we think that's pretty healthy for the workforce given the constraints that we're all operating under in the profession. I think it is unfortunate that budgets have been held so tight, yet at the same time as unemployment has dropped, you're starting to see real competition for talent out there, and that's starting to result in salary compression. And that's another tough problem because CEOs aren't granting a larger raise and increase budget, yet at the same time they're demanding the same kind of attention to retention that comp professionals would like very much to be addressing, but to do that you need money. And it's not entirely a zero-sum game. So I think that the profession's done a good job over the last 5 years of adapting and creating new paths to allocating that money where it's most needed.
Have you seen any change in how organizations are thinking about their external positioning as they're competing for talent? So a lot of the things we're seeing this shift, and organizations want to get the most bang for their buck, and they want to tie to performance where they can, and we're having lots of interesting conversations in our profession these days about that. But I wonder if we know from surveys that World at Work has conducted, market pricing and external benchmarking is still the prevalent practice. Do you see that shifting at any point?
No, I think that it's sound science, and it creates the outcomes that are intended, which are the ability to attract and retain the better talent to your organization. And from that perspective, it's a best practice. It's been well proven. Companies have been much more aware in the last 20 years of what's called employment branding. And compensation work is kind of a behind-the-scenes kind of undercurrent for that. But really the advent of social media has changed how employment branding is done. When I started, people like John Sumpser, who was a famous blogger back in the recruiting world, made a big deal out of employment branding, and there were multiple agencies that made their entire revenue off of going out and positioning a company for recruiting purposes. Today, that's happening organically on the web with social media, and it's harder to control the message. And so the role of a compensation professional actually becomes much more important in helping make sure that your employees are communicated with and understand that they're paid fairly, and that then when they're communicating out to the world about the employment brand of the company they work for, that they're communicating, yes, I might like to make more money than I make, but I'm paid fairly and I understand why. And so I think that under the surface of what's going on with employment branding is solid comp work and commitment to best practices.
You've touched on a number of different results that have come from a very complicated and exciting environment in compensation these days. There's a lot of factors at play. How about with pay inequities? What do you recommend when organizations see some of those inequities in their organizations and want to address them?
Well, I'm going to go on the record and say I love the pressure that's being put on solving the gender gap. I think it is difficult for companies. It is 21%, or at least it was a couple of years ago when they did the last big study. And it does deserve attention. On the other hand, it puts inordinate pressure on compensation professionals to live up to best practices, still protect the value of the high performers, and by the way, catch everybody up who have maybe fallen behind in their career earnings because of the impacts that drove the trend. So it does put more pressure on all of us, but it's coming. You've got the federal government putting in regulations that says that if you have over 100 employees, you're going to have to start reporting next year. And then you've got the states, Massachusetts and California in particular, that are going further, and they're really driving for job comparability, and putting in and kind of force best practices on a broader set of companies. I think, frankly, the regulations around that are going to require job comparability that are coming are going to be of some impact to large companies, but most companies with over 500 employees, they have comp professionals in place, and they're already doing, in many cases, a lot of this work. And they're going to be actually ahead of the game, and it's probably a little bit the mid-sized and smaller companies that don't follow best practices consistently inside their business. I think they're probably going to be more impacted by seeking to comply.
And Kent, how about some of the tactics that you recommend when organizations need to address those pay inequities?
Yeah, our clients are telling us that the way that they're addressing identifying the gaps and then solving for them is actually to use a compensation system and to load their employee data in, to market price the data, and then do some job leveling. And then there are reports in those systems that will spit out the pay differentials and the cost to close the gaps. And that seems to be what our clients are doing to solve for that problem.
One of the kind of emerging concepts is crowdsourced feedback and gathering data from employees, which is not new for comp professionals, but certainly a concept of crowdsourcing is perhaps something that compensation professionals need to be aware of, but talk about also how they actually might be able to use that.
I think there is some validity to the concept that you can use a social media number as a checkpoint and a reference point, but we today fall well short of suggesting that any compensation professionals should use that for setting pay inside their own organization. I think it's still very unproven, and I think there's a lot of skepticism out there among compensation professionals that the data is accurate enough to put any challenge on a survey-derived number.
So it's not a substitute for that employer-reported information, but perhaps something that can just complement or another piece of information to take into account.
It's always interesting to get data that you call your friend, you ask them, how are you paying these positions over here? That's not a survey answer, but that's an interesting data point that might help you with your analysis. So I don't think there's any harm in looking at it. We would fall short of saying you should build your practice around it today.
Great, thanks, Kent.
Thank you.
For World at Work TV, I'm Allison Avalos.